You ever walk out to check on a missing quo and stumble into a wedding? Huh? Then buckle up because that's exactly how this all began. One minute, Hank was sipping his black coffee. The next, he was standing in the middle of his hayfield, staring at a white tent large enough to shelter a circus, flanked by folding chairs, ribbon-wrapped arches, and the unmistakable sound of a string quartet rehearsing next to his tractor. Think about it, where were you the last time someone turned your backyard into a movie set without asking? Hank squinted against the morning light, half expecting it to be some kind of elaborate hallucination. But no, the music was real, the champagne trays were real, and the woman in designer sunglasses barking orders into her headset was as real as the goosebumps rising on his arms. A man with slicked back hair and a clipboard waved at Hank like he was a groundskeeper. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so brazen. Hank stood still for a long second, jaw tight, boots rooted in the alfalfa. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He just walked, slow and steady, the way someone does when they're not sure if they're angry or just utterly amazed at the audacity of it all. He passed by rows of luxury SUVs and sedans, parked diagonally across his grass like some godforsaken valet lot from Beverly Hills. Some were idling, air conditioners humming, mufflers steaming like the field was a pit stop on the way to Versailles. Young people in pastel suits were laughing, holding flutes of mimosas, as if this patch of dirt belonged to their uncle in wine country. Hank caught snippets of conversation seating arrangements, gluten-free cake, something about the bride's entrance needing to be cinematic. They were speaking in absolutes, in pre-booked, prepaid confidence, like nothing outside the tent existed. He found the first person who didn't look like they belonged, an older man tying streamers to one of Hank's apple trees. Calmly, Hank asked what was going on. The man, beaming like a proud uncle at a graduation, said, "Wedding, my niece. Isn't it beautiful?" Hank didn't answer. He tilted his head. On whose property? The man blinked, uncertain, then replied, "The community green law." Like Hank had asked where the sun rises. Hank nodded slowly and kept walking. He wasn't a man of fast tempers, but something sharp had settled in his chest. Not fury, something colder. The type of indignation born not from inconvenience, but from disrespect, from being assumed irrelevant, from being erased. He found her near the tent, commanding people like a general, oversized sunglasses, clipboard, beige wedges. When he asked who gave permission for all this, she barely looked up, just waved a piece of paper in his face and said, "Talk to the HOA." "Not me." Her voice was clipped. "Corporate." Hank took the paper. "Read it. Parcel 44B, community green space." But Hank didn't live in an HOA. Never had. This land, this exact parcel, was part of his family's homestead, surveyed by hand before the county even had official roads. He folded the paper, handed it back, and said with grave certainty, "This is my field, not yours, not theirs, mine." She scoffed, already turning away. "Sir, I really don't have time for this. Maybe go back to your porch and let us handle the wedding. The bride arrives in an hour." Her words left a film of contempt in the air. So Hank walked, past the tent, past the champagne tower, back up toward the hill, and that's when he noticed it. The roads, all three access points, had been decorated, blocked with ribbon garlands and freestanding signs that said, "Private event. Please respect the bride's day. Q." But the problem was the two gravel roads being used by all the cars, trucks, and delivery vans. They were his. He hadn't thought about them in years. They'd fallen out of daily use after the new highway went in, but legally they were still listed in his name. No transfer, no annexation, just overlooked lines on a dusty deed, like forgotten ghosts waiting for their day to rise. He crouched by a balloon-tied stake, pulled it from the ground. No markers, no flags, just dirt and disrespect. That's when it hit him. This wasn't just a trespass. This was a full-scale invasion dressed in white linen and peony garlands. They hadn't asked because they didn't think they needed to. They'd assumed, and that assumption so casual, So silent, sliced deeper than any insult. Not because they didn't know, but because they never cared to find out. Back at the house, Hank opened a tin lockbox from beneath his floorboards. Inside were papers so old they smelled of smoke and cedar. He unfolded the deed, traced the boundary lines with his finger. His name was still there, still etched in the county register. They hadn't taken it. They just built on top of it like it was already gone. He stood there for a long time, not with vengeance in mind, not even anger, just certainty. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ownership, not just of land, but of truth, of the space people think they can co-opt without asking, simply because they can't imagine anyone would object. Because people like Hank, quiet, older, rural, are so easy to edit out of the picture. But Hank wasn't edited out, not today. So he made himself another cup of coffee, sat on the porch, watched them from the hill like a man watching a storm that doesn't know it's already touched ground. They were still laughing down there, still toasting, still blind. Karen Emily, the HOA president, was near the catering truck. Hank recognized her instantly. She'd tried to buy this land from him 3 separate times. Maybe this was her workaround, her end run. Hank smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was so damn predictable. Arrogance always thinks it's clever, but it rarely checks the map. A truck rumbled past his gate. Vendor. Probably. Hank stood, dusted off his jeans, and went inside to call Ed, his old friend, his lawyer. You won't believe what the HOA just did, Hank said when Ed picked up. Try me, came the reply. Hank told him everything. The tent, the field, the permit, the roads. The silence on the other end stretched long. Then Ed said, you are about to have the most profitable day of your life. Hank laughed. Not from joy, from irony, because sometimes all it takes is a man with a thermos and a deed to show the world that just because something looks public doesn't mean it isn't owned. So I ask you, where would you be if someone took your land and threw a wedding on it like it was theirs? Would you rage? Would you fold? Or would you do what Hank did, go back to the house, make a list, and let the locks do the talking? The wedding guests were arriving in waves now, like a pastel-colored tide rolling steadily into Hank's field. SUVs with out-of-state plates glided through the gravel like royalty on tour. People emerged adjusting silk collars, checking phone mirrors, balancing gifts and garment bags. The tent stood proud in the center like a white monolith, surrounded by fake greenery and curated chaos. If you hadn't known better, you'd think this was always how the field looked, made for celebration, not cultivation. But Hank knew better, and he wasn't sitting idle. After his call with Ed, he'd taken out his tool set, the good one with the brass hinges and the heavy-duty padlocks. He wasn't a man of violence. He was a man of measures, and he had measures to take. While Karen Emily fussed at the wine vendor about ice deliveries, Hank was at the first road entrance, installing a gate, not a fancy one, nothing ornamental, just iron, chain, and authority. He bolted the hinges into the old post that had once held his father's fence line. The dust clung to his boots. The sun climbed higher. The noise below grew louder. But so did his clarity. By the time he reached the second entrance, the backup from cars was starting. They were getting bolder. Drivers rolled down their windows to shout directions or complaints as if Hank were part of the HOA's event staff. He didn't reply. He nodded once and finished tightening the chain on the second gate. The padlock clicked shut with the sound of finality, clean and unforgiving. From this angle, he could see the full spread of the wedding buffet tables, an open bar, the DJ booth being tested with pop songs that carried poorly over the open field. Someone had set up a fake photo booth near his irrigation line. A group of groomsmen tossed flower petals into the air like kids at a fair. They were laughing, playing like this land meant nothing, like it was a borrowed stage with no cost. Hank walked back toward his porch, carrying the wooden folding table that had lived in his barn for decades. He set it down at the top of the hill, not in the way, but deliberately visible. He placed a red cooler next to it, a cash box, and a sign written in bold marker, access fee, pay here. He unfolded a lawn chair, pulled his thermos from the side pocket, and sat. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about boundaries. The guests inside the event didn't notice at first. They were too busy posing with fake mustaches and sipping Prosecco. But as more vendors started hitting the gates and stopping confused, then angry the ripples began. Hank saw it happen in real time. The black sedan that honked twice at the lower gate, the wine delivery that turned around in frustration after 10 minutes, the photographer pacing the fence line with his phone to his ear. Guests near the tent began to look around. The energy shifted. The celebration, once breezy and confident, began to feel tight. The laughter grew thinner. The music seemed louder and more desperate. Then came the first confrontation. A man in a tailored blue jacket marched up the hill, white loafers kicking up dust. He slapped the sign on Hank's table with the back of his hand. "You trying to be funny, old man?" he asked. Hank looked up. Calm. "Nope," he replied. "Just running a toll booth. Same as your HOA runs gate fees for your community." The man scoffed. "This isn't an HOA road." Hank nodded. "Exactly." The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was loud. The man turned, confused, muttering as he walked away. Hank watched him go, then noticed Karen arriving in her signature white golf cart. The ribbons on it bounced merrily, belying the storm on her face. She was already arguing with someone when the man in blue intercepted her. Hank couldn't hear the words, but he could read the panic, the pointed fingers, the eyes darting toward the locked gate. Karen's face turned red. Then she started walking up the path toward Hank, clipboard in hand like a sword. She didn't greet him. She barked, "Unlock those gates. You're disrupting a private event." Hank didn't move. "No, ma'am," he said evenly. "I'm protecting private property and managing traffic on my roads." She stepped forward, nearly shouting, "These roads are for the community. Always have been." Hank didn't flinch. "Show me the deed." Karen opened her mouth, paused, shut it again. "You don't have it," Hank continued. "Because I do. You're on private roads and private land." She snapped. "We have permits." Hank leaned forward, sipping his coffee. "Wrong parcel," he said. "I already checked." Karen's jaw worked itself into a knot. "You're doing this to ruin a wedding, to prove a point." Hank shook his head. "I'm doing this because you decided I didn't matter." She growled something about calling the sheriff. "Please do," Hank replied. Pulling out his phone, he called the sheriff's office, gave them the parcel and road numbers, and requested a deputy to resolve an access dispute. Karen stood frozen, perfume thick in the air around her. Within 30 minutes, the sheriff's SUV arrived. The deputy, young, polite, stepped out and asked for documentation. Hank handed over the folder. The deputy reviewed everything, made a call, and then walked down the hill to Karen and her entourage. Hank couldn't hear the exchange, but he saw Karen's arms drop. The clipboard hit the ground. The deputy gestured toward Hank, then toward the gates. The verdict was clear. Guests began approaching the table one by one. An older couple handed over an envelope without a word. A young man grumbled, paid, and left. A woman offered a check. Hank declined, cash only. He said gently, handing her a receipt. The line began to form. Some were irritated, some embarrassed. But all were learning a hard lesson. The man they ignored had every right to be here and every right to charge for access across his land. Back at the tent, the orchestra played on, but their rhythm was off. The planner whispered furiously into her headset. Guests muttered among themselves. The bar had run out of ice. The delivery truck couldn't get through. Someone had unplugged Hank's power line to use for their sound system without asking. A few guests started shaking the gates themselves, testing the locks. They held. One man in khakis tried sneaking through a hedgerow, but Hank intercepted him without a word. The man fled, and Hank simply returned to his chair, tightening the chain for good measure. Then came Karen's second offensive, this time with a man in a blazer, legal pad in hand, confidence leaking from every pore. "You're holding people hostage," he declared. "I'm enforcing private access," Hank replied. The lawyer argued, cited clauses, waved papers. Hank waited. then held up his own documentation. Deed filed, rights never transferred. Sheriff confirmed it. The man read it, blinked, slowly packed his briefcase, and left. By now, the sun had begun to dip. The ceremony continued, but the magic was gone. The bride arrived late. Stepping delicately from a limo stopped outside the gate, she was greeted by tension masked as elegance. The bartender apologized again about the cocktail station. Guests checked their phones, looking for signal. One bridesmaid sat on a log crying. Flight missed. No way out. Hank remained a fixture, silent, unmoved. The line at his table ebbed and flowed. Some handed cash wordlessly, some cracked awkward jokes. One woman laughed, called it the most exciting wedding she'd ever been to. Hank told her to keep the receipt, might be worth something one day. As darkness fell, the music quieted, lights flickered. The celebration had become survival. People now lingered at the edge of the field, watching the man with the coffee and the cash box, the man who said nothing, but whose silence shouted the truth louder than any microphone. The wedding wasn't canceled, but it was never the same again. And every inch they walked that day, every mile driven across that gravel was a toll in more ways than one. The morning after the wedding felt like the aftermath of a slow-moving storm. The field, once dotted with pastel suits and satin, now resembled a battlefield of confetti, torn streamers, and upturned chairs. Dew clung to discarded napkins and crushed flower petals, creating a strange, soggy mosaic over Hank's hay. The open bar was just an empty frame now, stripped of its charm, and the sound system had been covered with tarp that flapped gently in the breeze. Hank woke early, as he always did, and made coffee strong enough to peel paint. He stepped out onto the porch and surveyed the aftermath with the calm of a man who'd already seen the worst part of it. The gates were still locked, the sign still up. Most guests had slept in their cars or huddled beneath the big tent like stranded travelers at a derailed luxury event. Some had paid and left late into the night, but many had stayed, banking on hope, convenience, or perhaps arrogance. Hank sat down at his table again, not in triumph, but in routine. This was no longer a protest, it was policy. At around 7:15, the first brave soul of the morning approached. A woman in workout clothes, mascara smudged, sneakers wet with dew. She didn't argue. She just handed him two 20s and walked back down the hill without a word. A few minutes later, a small trickle began: families with kids, older couples, bridesmaids with runny makeup. They paid in silence, most not making eye contact. And then, like clockwork, Karen arrived. But she was different this time. No clipboard, no heels, no golf cart, just a wrinkled blouse, messy hair tied back, and exhaustion etched across her face. She walked alone, holding a takeaway coffee in a small folder. Her approach was slow, deliberate, like she was walking through a field of eggshells. Hank looked up but didn't stand. She didn't speak until she was a few feet from the table. "Look," she began, her voice lower, even cautious. "We just want to wrap this up peacefully." Hank sipped his coffee. "You've made your point," she added. "Everyone's had a long night. We can offer you a flat payment to open the gates." He raised an eyebrow. "How much?" $1,000, she said, almost too quickly. Hank shook his head gently. "That wouldn't cover the wine crates crushed into my grass or the 3 tire ruts by the fence line." She blinked, taken aback. "Then what do you want?" He paused for a long moment. Respect would have been a nice place to start. "But for now, I'll settle for the toll." She flinched, same as yesterday. He continued, $500 per vehicle, cash only. Receipts available if your HOA wants to write it off as educational expense." She didn't laugh. She didn't even argue, just turned and walked away. The same slow gait, her shoulders hunched like someone carrying a weight she hadn't prepared for. By 9 a.m., the field had turned into an unofficial queue. Some guests tried to negotiate. Hank listened, then pointed at the posted rate. A man tried to Venmo him. He declined. One guy claimed diplomatic immunity. Hank offered him a chair while he looked it up. No one took down the signs. No one called the sheriff again. The rules were now clear. A little after 10, a new SUV arrived. Clean, sleek, tinted windows. Out stepped a man in a navy suit, crisp shirt, leather briefcase in hand. His walk was precise, his smile sharp. Hank stood as he approached. "Mr. Thompson," the man asked. "That's me. I represent the HOA's legal counsel. We'd like to resolve this matter." Hank nodded, waited. "We're prepared to offer a formal settlement." The man continued. $2,000 to cover road usage and minor damages. It would be retroactive. In addition, you'd keep what's already been collected at the gate. Hank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly and pointed toward the field. "You see all that? The tire ruts, the trampled grass, the cords still plugged into my barn. You see my crushed fence post down there?" The man hesitated. "I see general disarray." "Yeah," Hank turned back. "Then tell me, does 2,000 sound like a fair exchange for all that?" The lawyer didn't respond. Hank continued, "I'll be contacting the county survey office and a property appraiser this afternoon. I'll have a full report of the damages, plus a civil claim filed if your HOA decides not to pay the proper invoice. This isn't a backroom deal. It's property law." The lawyer adjusted his tie, eyes narrowing. "So you're serious? Dead serious?" Hank replied. The man gave a curt nod, walked back to the SUV, and left without another word. The line at the gate picked up again, this time quieter. A few guests apologized. One elderly man shook Hank's hand and thanked him for standing his ground. A couple of teenagers took selfies beside the toll table, laughing quietly. Hank didn't mind. Let the story spread. Let it be told around kitchen tables and at barbecues and in HOA meetings across the country. Let it be a warning in casual tones. Don't assume the land you stand on isn't watching you. By noon, only a few vehicles remained. Cleanup crews had arrived with rakes and trash bags. Though not hired by the HOA, Hank had called his own. They knew how to treat the land with care. The irony wasn't lost on him that the people who used his field without permission weren't the ones fixing it. But that's the nature of entitlement. It rarely cleans up after itself. Hank paid the workers fairly and stood by as they reseeded the torn patches, picked up broken glass, and salvaged what could be recycled. Then, around 1:30, Karen returned. Third time's the charm. But this time she wasn't there to argue. She parked further back, walked slower. This time, she was holding a single envelope. Hank met her halfway down the hill. No clipboard, no sarcasm, just a tired woman standing in front of the man she tried to bulldoze. "This isn't official," she said. "It's personal." She held out the envelope. Inside, a note, handwritten, brief. "We were wrong. Thank you for the lesson." That was all it said. Hank nodded, folded it once, and slipped it into his jacket. She turned to leave. No long speeches, no closure ceremony. Just quiet acknowledgement that the narrative had changed. That afternoon, as Hank sat back on his porch watching the crews finish, his phone buzzed. "Ed again. You're trending." The old lawyer chuckled. "Trending, that guest live-streamed everything. It's all over the internet. People are calling you the Hayfield hero." Hank laughed. "Didn't ask for that. You didn't have to." Ed replied, "You just had to be right, and patient, and maybe a little poetic." Hank leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the mended fence line. "Think I should say something? I think you already did." Ed said, "But if you want it in ink, I know a guy at the county paper." As the day faded and the last of the wedding vanished like a fever dream, Hank brewed another pot of coffee, not to stay awake, but to savor it. He had stood his ground without shouting, held his peace without surrender, and in doing so, reminded an entire town that ownership isn't about fences, it's about presence, about showing up, about not being erased. By midweek, the quiet had returned to Hank's land, but it was a new kind of quiet one that felt like the deep exhale after a storm that never quite shattered the barn, but sure left the shingles rattled. The wedding was over, the guests gone, and the hayfield that had once hummed with string quartets and gossiping bridesmaids now stretched wide and hollow, marked only by tire ruts, broken centerpieces, and patches of grass that looked too stunned to stand upright again. The trash was mostly picked clean, thanks to the crew Hank had called, but remnants still lingered: floral foam stuck in a fence post, a pair of high heels abandoned in the mud near the lower gate, glitter embedded in the grain of his porch steps. The strange part was how the whole town had shifted. It wasn't just the local news or that now famous viral video of Hank at the toll table waving his thermos at a furious Karen. It was the way people looked at him differently at the post office. The way the neighbor kids waved when riding their bikes past the ranch. He'd always been Old Man Thompson to most of them. Now, there was a new word floating behind their eye: rightful. That's what stuck most. Not just the validation, but the fact that it had taken so much disruption for people to remember where they stood and whose land they were standing on. The HOA board hadn't said much publicly, but word had a way of trickling out of that tidy little clubhouse like coffee under a crooked lid. Karen's reputation had fractured fast. The meeting after the wedding debacle had been closed door, but enough leaked out to make the front page of the local paper. 3 board members had called for her resignation. 2 demanded a vote of censure. Karen had reportedly tried to blame the planner, the permit office, even the county assessor's outdated maps. But no one was buying it anymore. You can only deflect so much before the arrows land in your own yard. Photos of her at the gate, red-faced and finger-pointing, had become local meme fodder. Teenagers were printing T-shirts that said "Respect the Fence" and tagging the ranch in parody videos. Hank wasn't thrilled about being the center of a cultural moment, but he had to admit, the sign someone anonymously mailed him, black lettering on oak board that read "Private Road Permission Matters," made for a pretty satisfying decoration above his fireplace. 3 days after the wedding, a certified envelope arrived at Hank's door. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA's legal team. Clean language, straight to the point. They acknowledged the mistake, agreed to pay the full invoice that Hank had meticulously calculated, down to the broken wire ties and gasoline spent on extra trips into town. They included a promise, signed by the board, that no future events or development would be planned involving Hank's land without written consent. It wasn't an apology, not technically, but the legalese had a new tone measured. Quiet, almost reverent. Hank read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer beneath the deed. The war was over, but the lesson still had legs. That weekend, a car pulled up to the gate again. Same SUV as before. Karen stepped out alone. No papers, no entourage. She didn't slam the door, didn't march. She walked, steady, slower than before. She approached the fence where Hank stood, leaned slightly against the post. Her hair was down, loose, her face bare of makeup. "I came to say thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet, unsure, but honest in a way Hank hadn't heard before. He didn't reply, just listened. "It wasn't personal," she added. She paused, corrected herself. "I underestimated what this land meant. What you meant." Hank studied her face for a moment, then spoke. "It's never personal until it's your fence." She nodded slowly, pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket. "It's not much, just a note. No lawyers." He accepted it without a word. She turned to leave. No speech. No plea. Just a woman who had finally seen the map of what it was: not a battleground, but a boundary. After she left, Hank sat back down on his porch and opened the note. It was handwritten in clean cursive. 5 words. "We were wrong. Thank you." He stared at it for a long moment, then set it aside and picked up the small guest book that had been left behind under one of the catering tables. A few pages were blank. One message stood out near the middle. "Most memorable wedding ever. Your field taught us more than the vows did." No signature, just ink and impact. Later that afternoon, Hank was at the local feed store when the young clerk at the counter gave him a grin. "Hey, you seen Channel 7? They're doing a follow-up on you. Said something about property rights pioneer." Hank raised an eyebrow, bought his seed mix, and left without comment. Back home, he turned on the TV just long enough to catch a segment clips from the wedding, guest interviews, even drone footage of the tent with the gates firmly shut. The anchor called it a rare case of rural resistance done right. Hank turned off the TV, but not before the reporter closed with, "In a time when assumptions often override permission." One farmer reminded the world that the ground beneath our feet still has a name, and sometimes it's written in ink that can't be erased. The attention didn't end there. Letters began arriving, some from nearby towns, some from states away. Farmers wrote to share similar stories. Small landowners thanked him for the inspiration. One envelope from New Mexico held a handmade wooden keychain that read, "Stand your ground." Farmer. Hank hung it on the wall next to the framed photo someone had mailed of him standing at the toll table, arms crossed, thermos in hand. The wedding tent blurred in the background. At the bottom, in bold, "You are not invisible." By Sunday, the field had begun to look like itself again. Grass rebounded. Birds returned. The silence wasn't sterile, it was earned. Hank walked the perimeter slowly, checking fence posts, ensuring the gates were still firm. At the second entrance, a small note had been tied to the chain with twine. It was written on the back of a wedding program. "Heard your land, felt your boundary. We paid, we learned. No name, just impact." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in muted gold, Hank sat beside Ed on the porch, both of them nursing cold drinks and letting the silence speak first. Ed finally broke it. "You know, this whole thing could have gone sideways. They could have doubled down, brought more lawyers, gone full ugly." Hank nodded. "They still might, but they'll think twice now." Ed chuckled. "Hell of a thing. You didn't throw the wedding, but you sure collected the cover charge." Hank grinned. "And next time, they'll knock before they hang lanterns in my trees." Later that night, Hank took 2 wooden signs he'd been carving over the past few days and installed them by lantern light. The first, posted clearly at both road entrances, read "Private Road, access by permission only." The second, smaller, sat below it, "You are now entering respectful country." He didn't make an announcement, didn't post online, but anyone passing through would know. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reminder. The field had memory now, and so did the people who once assumed it was theirs to decorate. The week after the dust settled passed slower than usual, like time itself had paused to consider what just happened on that field. Hank didn't change his routine. He still rose before dawn, brewed his black coffee strong enough to wake ghosts, fed the animals, walked the perimeter, but something about the way he moved felt different, more deliberate. The land was healing, but so was something else, something quieter. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. The wedding was over. The HOA had paid. The legal mess was folded into a drawer next to the deed. But the echo of it all still rippled outward. People hadn't stopped talking. In town, folks greeted Hank with nods that lingered longer than before. The post office clerk asked him if he was going to install turnstiles. A high schooler asked for a selfie in front of the gate. Someone nailed a small hand-carved sign to the telephone pole near the ranch entrance. "Thompson Country permission required." Hank left it up. He figured it wasn't wrong. By Friday, word came through Ed that Karen had formally resigned from the HOA board. Not with a bang, not with a statement, just a 2-sentence email and a forwarded memo from the replacement chair. A man from the post office who wore pressed slacks and always said hello at the gas station. They were revising the community bylaws, new rules about easement checks, land use verification, and mandatory owner consultation. Hank read the list Ed forwarded to him and chuckled. Shame it took a champagne spill and a locked gate to teach what a handshake used to. Ed replied with a simple, "Better late than never." On Saturday morning, a knock came at Hank's door. It wasn't a stranger, it was Sam, his nearest neighbor, carrying a sack of apples and a grin that could split a stump. "Heard you're a local celebrity," Sam said, stepping onto the porch without waiting to be invited. Hank poured him a lemonade and they sat for a while. Watching the sky stretch its arms into noon, Sam eventually leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You ever thought about throwing your own party?" Hank raised an eyebrow. "What for?" Sam shrugged. "To reclaim the ground, I suppose. No tents, no wedding planners, just people who ask before they show up. That idea stuck in Hank's mind like a splinter with charm. A few days later, he made some calls. He didn't advertise, didn't post flyers, just told the people who mattered: Ed, Sam, the cleanup crew, the deputy who'd backed him, the clerk from the courthouse who'd helped him dig up the old survey maps. By the end of the week, the invitation had rippled its way through town without ever needing to be printed. When Saturday came, cars pulled up respectfully along the designated parking signs Hank had hammered into the dirt himself. Nobody crossed into the field without first stopping by the porch. Nobody needed to be told what the boundaries were. They were visible, invisible, understood. A band played under a canvas tarp strung between two oaks. Not fancy, just four locals and a fiddle. Kids ran barefoot through the hay paths. People brought ribs, corn salad, fresh pies, and set them down without fuss or ceremony. The cooler was filled with ice this time, brought by a guest who asked first. At one point, the deputy walked up to Hank holding a soda and said, "You realize this is the most polite event this land has ever seen?" Hank laughed. That's what happens when people know they can be locked out. As dusk settled in and the last of the smoke from the barbecue pit curled into the branches, Hank stood quietly by the fence, watching the scene. It wasn't a celebration of victory. It was a reminder of presence, of what it looked like when land was respected, not assumed. Sam came up beside him, chewing on a toothpick. Think they'll ever try to pull something again? Hank didn't look away. If they do, they'll remember the gate. That night, Ed stayed late, sitting with Hank on the porch as stars stitched themselves across the sky. Ed scrolled through photos on his phone, the wedding chaos, the locked gates, the picnic today. "You ever think about how close it came to going the other way?" he asked. "If you hadn't kept that deed, hadn't remembered those roads?" Hank nodded. "I think about it all the time. Control doesn't vanish all at once. It gets chipped away, one assumption at a time, one ignored boundary after another. People stop knocking, then they start building." A few days later, Hank received a package with no return address. Inside was a framed print of the viral photo, him at the table, arms crossed, wedding in full swing behind him, and beneath it, a caption in block letters, "Respect the fence." He mounted it above the fireplace without hesitation, not out of vanity, but out of ritual. A reminder, not of what happened, but of what didn't. He hadn't lost or he hadn't folded. The field, by now, had almost fully recovered. Only one patch of grass near the archway's former site still resisted regrowth. Hank left it untouched, not out of neglect, but preservation, a marker. People had danced there, argued there, learned something there. One afternoon, a couple from out of town stopped by, asked if they could take a photo near the fence. Hank obliged, but only after they introduced themselves, explained how they'd heard the story, and asked if it was okay. That last part, is it okay, mattered more than they knew. In late fall, as leaves began to surrender their color, Hank stood by the top of the hill and looked down at the field, arms folded, wind cool on his neck. He thought about how easily the whole thing could have faded into bitterness, about how often landowners like him were ignored, dismissed, written over by HOA plans and real estate brochures. But this time, it had been different. This time, someone had said no and meant it. And more importantly, someone had said, "You don't get to decide my story for me." Hank turned back toward the porch. On the gatepost, the small carved sign still hung crooked. He straightened it, patted it once, then walked inside as the first drops of winter rain tapped gently on the tin roof. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind the earth that it still belonged to someone who paid attention and who expected you to knock.